Imagine that Jim Morrison was not simply a rock star, but some sort of guide to another realm. In this strange corridor between sound and spirit, was he a shamanic teacher of poetry, song, and myth-making? Let's break on through to the other side here on Things Visible and Invisible. Paul Wyld is a singer-songwriter, poet, visual artist and author with a deep interest in the intersection of art and spirituality. His most recent book, Jim Morrison, Secret Teacher of the Occult, presents Morrison not so much as one of rock music's greatest frontmen, but as a shamanic showman backlit by Esoteric. And its author joins me down the line from his home in Los Angeles, California. Paul, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you very much for having me.
Paul, when I first came across your work, I was absolutely fascinated by it. Jim Morrison is one of those rock gods, I suppose we would suggest, though he is one which has attracted more legend than fact in the years since his demise, indeed, if he did die. So moving him into the realm of Esoterica, the realm of what you have in your book, is perhaps not as unexpected as many would imagine. However, where did this quest, where did this interest start for you?
Well, my personal story is sort of a little bit intertwined with writing this book. I moved back to Los Angeles in 2016, and looking back, I guess you can say I went into my own version of what the alchemists call a negredo phase, which in spiritual terms would be a dark night of the soul, coming back to myself, kind of a stormy time in my life. And I went back to my first love, which are, good books about all things that are strange and very interesting. And I came across Gary Lachman's 2015 book, The Secret Teachers of the Western World. And the cover struck me. I thought the title sounded very interesting. I have a deep passion for history, and I was immediately absorbed by it. And I was, learning something pretty powerful about myself while I was reading. And the book was a great pleasure to read, very elegantly written, loaded with facts and loaded with things that I never knew before. I'd never heard of the Western esoteric tradition before 2016. And the more I was reading this book, the more I just kept thinking about, Jim Morrison. And by the end of this book, I had the pages all copied up with JM next to certain paragraphs. And I felt that I had discovered something about not only myself, learned something about the Western esoteric tradition, but I felt like I had a big clue as to who Jim Morrison was and why we feel that he's just so much more than a rock star. And I read it again, and then it led me to other different books and to other things. And finally, I concluded that, this is a very important piece to the puzzle of who Jim Morrison was. He's such an enigmatic, mysterious person. But I really think his core is much like the secret teachers that Gary Lachman describes in his book. Okay. And finally, it came to the point where I decided this is going to be my first book. I went to all the biographies about Jim Morrison, all the other books written about him. The one book that goes into the more esoteric and occult aspects of his life was a book written by James Morrison and Jerry Prochnicki called "Break On Through the Life and Death of Jim Morrison." And James Morrison was very helpful and supportive, like during writing this. And he goes into one chapter into a lot of detail about shamanism, and it's very extensive. But that's all that I could really find. And then when I read The Lords and the New Creatures, his collection of poems, there's a great deal of insight into in that collection of poetry, about the occult and alchemy and its relationship to film. And I thought that's an absolutely remarkable consciousness to have when you're just 18, 19, 20 years old. To be able to make these very astute connections between avant-garde cinema and alchemy. And I realized that just how very, very far along in knowledge and understanding of these very difficult, enigmatic subjects that Jim Morrison was involved with, seemed to understand very much. So I decided in 2019 that I'm going to write a book, and I even snapshotted the moment that I decided to write. It was November 11th at 11:11 a.m. And then I got busy. I could actually write a book about writing this book. It was actually quite a journey. I found all the right books that I needed at the right time, and things seemed to happen in a sort of like, divinely unfolding way.
Well, we're going to dig into all of that, Paul, and you've set it up absolutely wonderfully. But before we do, believe it or not, there will be people watching this who have no idea who Jim Morrison is or was, and also of his significance for a whole generation. So I think we better backtrack a little bit and start at the beginning. James Morrison, let's have a little bio of who he was and how he ended up so to the fore in late 60s American culture.
Jim Morrison was born in 1943. He was born in Melbourne, Florida. He was born into a military family that moved around a lot. His father was a Navy pilot during World War II. Then he went on to become an aircraft carrier captain of the USS Bonhomme Richard. His aircraft carrier group was present at the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which kicked off the Vietnam War right about the time that Jim Morrison was in college. Yes, they moved around a lot. He had two brothers and sisters. So since they moved around a lot, Jim Morrison would make friends, and then he would have to leave them. Such as his friend Fudd Ford, they became closest when he started high school in Alameda, California, in 1956. So he really just had his brother and his sister, growing up. He was very intellectual. He was very artistic. His IQ was just below 150. He read a great deal. By the time he graduated high school, he had over 1,000 books in his room in Alexandria, Virginia. He graduated there from Alexandria, High School. George Washington High School in Alexandria, Virginia. And then he went to community college in Florida, and he had ambitions. Well, he wanted to go on to get a degree in filmmaking, and he had a very deep interest in avant-garde filmmaking. He told his college girlfriend, Mary Werbelow, that he wanted to be able to get out his fantasies and visions on film. He went to FSU, and then he went to Florida State University, and then he transferred to UCLA in 1964 in Los Angeles. His parents are very dead set against that path. They didn't want him to do that, but he enrolled anyway and transferred from FSU. And then at UCLA, that's when Jim Morrison started to meet friends that he could really connect with, such as the future organist in the Doors, Raymond Manzarek, who at the time was getting his master's in fine arts and film at UCLA, and they bonded. And he was able to bond with other intellectuals and other very serious filmmakers. At the time, Francis Ford Coppola was going to school there also. I haven't been able to find any kind of literature that says whether or not they met or not, but Francis Ford Coppola seems to remember him. It was a place of a lot of very talented, very intellectual, very intelligent filmmakers who were very serious about doing that. So he graduated UCLA in 1965, and he did not have any interest to go into Hollywood. He said that he felt that Hollywood was syrup for the masses. That's not what he was into. Jim Morrison loved French New Wave film. He loved the film Contempt, made by Godard, and he loved Francois Truffaut. As a matter of fact, on YouTube, you can see when Jim Morrison is in Paris in the latter days of his life that he's on a film set, and with one of Francois Truffaut's films, and you can see the both of them there. No interest in getting a job when he got out of college. And he narrowly avoided getting drafted going into Vietnam, which is a whole story in itself. And he became serious to the idea of moving to New York City. He wanted to work with Jonas Mekas, who's considered the godfather of American avant-garde filmmaking, because that was Jim Morrison's big interest, his original ambition. But he decided that he couldn't see himself being in charge of all kinds of film equipment and everything like that. And I also think it has a lot to do with, if you move to New York City, that means you'd have to get a job, you have to pay rent because you're in a place where it's winter and it's very, you can't live a beatnik existence, with as much comfort in New York as you can here in California. So he moves to Venice Beach, which is a bohemian community here in Los Angeles. At the time, the two big centers of the beatnik world were Greenwich Village in New York City and North Beach and the Haight-Ashbury up in San Francisco. But just as powerful with that spirit was Venice Beach in Los Angeles. But the Venice Beach beatniks and writers, they didn't really have much of an interest in becoming, famous and making a name for themselves. Like this is a more this is a much more gritty and tough environment, for beatniks who are artists and writers. So Jim Morrison gravitated there, and he started living on the beach. He started living under the Santa Monica Pier. When he graduated, his parents stopped paying the rent on his apartment, and said, "You got to go on, do your thing." He lost a relationship with Mary Werbelow that he really loved her, and she basically told him that all you know are books. You need to go find yourself. So he started living under the Santa Monica Pier, and that's where he wrote The End, and which is about his breakup with Mary Werbelow, which of course blossomed into this fantastic artistic song, right? And he ran into Ray Manzarek, who thought he was moving to New York, and Ray Manzarek was surprised at how he'd looked. He'd lost a lot of weight. He'd grown his hair out, and he sang him songs that he had been writing. And that part of Oliver Stone's movie is correct. They met on the beach again, and this greatly excited Raymond Manzarek, and he thought, we should start a rock band. And I think with one of the very astute things that Jim Morrison did was that he was able, since he was such a creative person to begin with, he was able to see that rock music was a way for him to, among many things, be able to communicate his connection to what Gary Lachman calls in The Secret Teachers of the Western World, that other reality that all secret teachers have a connection to. And it comes out all over the music. I mean, the song "Break On Through" is essentially, Jim Morrison's very powerful statement, to wake up, to break on through, to that other side. And at the time, the world is going through pretty much the most popular occult awakening I think the world has ever experienced. I think it's actually happening now in an even bigger way since then. It's coming back around. So if people were ready for somebody like Jim Morrison, where I think in any other epic, I don't know if Jim Morrison would have enjoyed the kind of popularity and success, that they had with the Doors, because people were ready for this very mysterious person who was very spiritual in nature, who did have the soul of a secret teacher with a very close connection, to that other reality. And because he was so talented, intelligent, and a very elegant, mysterious persona, and also a sex symbol at the same time. It was just an undeniable attraction for people as to who this person was. Not only was he just a joy to watch and listen to, and the fun of being a rock star, but you also, at the same time, we're all touched in this very deep and spiritual way that this person is reminding us, that there is a separate reality that we live in, and everyone was ready for him at that time. So the 1960s was the perfect milieu for Jim Morrison to have decided to become a rock star. I think you should add also that in occult terms, speaking with astrology, Jim Morrison had a Leo North Node, and people with their North Node in Leo, that is they're going up in your North Node is where you have your fulfillment. And Leo North Node people, they gain their fulfillment by being on stage, by being up front, by being out there, being the champion of something that they really believe in front of a large audience. And even though Jim Morrison was a really private person, he was a writer and he was a poet. He had that side of him. So you had this very unique combination of this really private person who reveals himself, on stage. He wants you to come into his world, and we're very attracted, by that, just by how he looks and his mysteriousness. I'd like to say that Jim Morrison, he died in 1971. And that's the same year that Colin Wilson's really brilliant book, The Occult, came out, a very large book. And what Colin Wilson said about that work after it was published was that he's even more mystified and even more I'm curious about all the things that he'd written about, as if there was just so much more to learn. And and Jim Morrison also, he passed away in 1971. I feel the same way about him. After having written this book, I'm still discovering things about him, like the podcast that I've been doing, and just in thinking about it, that he remains as mysterious as ever after this. And I think that is a very big part of why people love Jim Morrison so much, is that he reminds of his statement.
Absolutely.
That the Swiss-American artist and author Kurt Seligman used to start his book, The History of Magic and the Occult, off, that Jim Morrison read in high school from Albert Einstein, that the fairest thing that we can experience is the mysterious. And I think with Jim Morrison, that is what we feel. Like we're experiencing something that's really very satisfying in a very mysterious way. And that's a large part of why he's timeless and he is still with us.
That's a very interesting summation of Jim Morrison's early life and his ascent. We could probably speed matters on a little bit, Paul, by saying that he became a great rock star and was at the zenith of his powers in the late 60s and early 70s. But there was something as well about Jim Morrison which was kind of incomplete, like a lot of rock stars of that era. Just lay the framework of the state of mind, the where Jim Morrison was by the time he ended up in Paris, 1971.
Well, I think over time, Jim Morrison became ambivalent about being a rock star. I think when he was young, he was 21 and he was living on the beach. He had put himself through a shamanic initiation in which he was, blowing his mind open with like copious amounts of psychedelics and other kind of drugs that, I think would put most any of us like in a mental hospital, or perhaps, we wouldn't even survive that kind of assault on the mind, or breaking on through is how he would put it, right? And it was, he had all of these ideas and all of these songs in his mind, and he said he envisioned a fantastic rock concert. When he met Raymond Manzarek again on the beach, and then they went through all the things that they had to do in forming a band and starting their work on the Sunset Strip, and eventually being able to play at the Whiskey A Go Go, which where they were discovered by Jack Holzman at Elektra Records. But we have to remember Jim Morrison is that before he was a rock star, he was an intellectual, with short hair, and he was kind of pudgy. He did not look, like he looked, but that as we know him. And his friend Frank Lissandro said that, when he was on tour, he had that rock star persona, but when he was here at home in Los Angeles, you could see him with his long beard in the bars and the cafes in Los Angeles, like writing in his notebooks and writing poetry and talking to himself and more or less living the life of a writer, of a poet, which is what he was really all about. And he really didn't think too much about staying in shape. Let's say the way that Mick Jagger does. Like if you go online now, like Mick Jagger has like a 3-hour video about him going to the gym every day. But Jim Morrison was not really that kind of person. And he drank a lot because he, for many, many, many reasons, his drinking is a really complicated subject. But that was the thing that writers did. They liked their booze, and so did Jim Morrison, and then that took its toll on his health. I think in the beginning with the Doors, they were seen as this amazing artistic avant-garde band that was not only loved by people who were loved underground music, but they were loved by people who were very attracted to a lot of avant-garde fringe intellectual stuff and all the things that Jim Morrison was about in New York and in Los Angeles, and that was a great artistic heyday for the Doors. I think part of what happened when they became very famous is that suddenly he was in front of large arenas, big concerts, filled with teenagers coming to see, Jim Morrison pull off all of his antics. And he was ambivalent about that. He felt that he had to project more because there were more people there and the audience was paying more money to see them. But he told his sister that, when I go to recite my poetry on stage, like the audience just doesn't, really seem to care. Not as much as they did in the beginning when the Doors are playing more intimate venues like the Whiskey A Go Go and other places in New York City. So that kind of disappointed him.
Yeah.
And I think over time he just did not want to be remembered for just being a sex symbol, and he felt that that's what was going to happen to him. He did say that in an interview, he said, "My God, like, when I'm older, I have to look at these pictures of myself, and that's just ridiculous. Like, I don't want to be known for being a sex symbol. I want to be known for being an artist, for being a poet. And that's what mattered the most to him, because that's what he wanted to express his connection to that other reality through his work." Very complicated. So I think Jim Morrison, well, he was under a lot of pressure to maintain the success of the Doors, to reinvent himself, to come up with a fresh image and fresh ideas and fresh creative ideas. He did not want to devolve into becoming a nostalgia act. That's the worst kind of fear for someone as creative as Jim Morrison and then the other members in the Doors. Also, I think he wanted to go to Paris to get away from Los Angeles and the whole rock scene for a while, and come back to his notebooks and come back to his poetry. And what better place to do it than Paris, where some of his great heroes, once worked and lived, such as the poet Arthur Rimbaud and the playwright Antonin Artaud. Both these people influenced Jim Morrison a great deal. He did tell the Doors manager, Bill Siddons, before leaving, that he just didn't know who he was, and he was really wanting to get back to his core self, like the person that originally wanted to be a filmmaker, wanted to be an artist. He felt like he had lost sight of that somewhat, and he wanted to reacquaint himself with himself again. The Doors didn't break up. They did make a fantastic album that did well was starting to do well when he was in Paris. And if he had survived, I'm sure he would have wanted to have come back and to make more records with the other members of the Doors. So he went to Paris to make a turning point in his life, just to come back to himself and get reestablished with his own artistic identity as a poet.
And did he go on his own to Paris, Paul?
His girlfriend at the time was Pamela Courcine, and she went to Paris first. And then Jim Morrison followed soon after. This was in 1971, in the spring of 1971. And when they arrived, their apartment wasn't ready yet. So they actually lived in the same apartment that Oscar Wilde lived in,
wow.
Where he passed. The famous statement where he said that, "I don't know which is going to go first, like me or that wallpaper."
Yes.
So it's just fascinating that just 3 months later, he was laid to rest in the same cemetery as Oscar Wilde. Now, Oscar Wilde, he went to Paris to basically do the same thing that Jim Morrison did. He was put in jail for 2 years, and this was a disastrous experience for his health. And he went to Paris to recover from all of that, and unfortunately he didn't. And the same thing happened with Jim Morrison. He couldn't recover from that. I think what had also a very big part of all of this is that the trial in Miami, where he was accused of having indecently exposed himself to the audience, he was convicted of that. And there were 10,000 photographs submitted during that trial. Not one showed him doing that. All the witnesses at the trial, they did not recall him exposing himself to the audience. Yet a 3-man and 3-woman jury found him guilty of indecent exposure. And the one, according to Robert Krieger, the guitarist in the Doors, the one thing that he was guilty of doing was public drunkenness, and that charge was dropped. And so then he was still on bond, and he was on bond when he was in Paris, pending appeal. Now his lawyers were telling him, saying, "Look, this case is ridiculous. There's a high probability we're going to get this thrown out." But Jim Morrison was, you're Jim Morrison, you have to say to yourself, but I've already been, convicted of something that I did not do. And when he was in Paris, he was asking his lawyers and other people if they could give him some kind of an assurance that if he was found guilty, if he wouldn't be sent to where they wanted to send him in Florida, one of the worst prisons in the United States, which is Rayford Prison. That would have been disastrous for Jim Morrison. He might not have, been able to walk out of there. They may, he could be in a place where he could be killed. And I think this frightened him. So when he was in Paris, he felt a lot of anxiety about what would happen to him if he went back to the United States. Would he be destroyed if he did that? There's a parallel to one secret teacher in the Western esoteric tradition that Jim Morrison has a lot of affinity with, and his name is Giordano Bruno. And this happened to Giordano Bruno in the late 16th century. He left Italy because his ideas were getting too controversial and it was getting too dangerous for him. He comes back in the early part of the last decade of the 16th century to Venice. He finds a patron. He was a rambunctious man like Jim Morrison. He had a falling out with his patron, and the Venetian authorities remembered who he was and arrested him. And then the Pope brought him to Rome and imprisoned him for 6 years. And then in 1600, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake. So I'm not clear whether or not Jim Morrison was familiar who Giordano Bruno was, but I can guarantee that Jim Morrison was very familiar with what happened to people like him who ran afoul of the government, of society's mores at that time, and he was very anxious about it.
Talk to me a little bit, because the premise of your book, Paul, is Morrison as an occult teacher. Talk to me a little bit about the kind of occult. You've talked before about some of the artistic influences, be the movie making avant-garde, and obviously the musical influences are well documented. In terms of occult influences, writers, movements of the time or predating the 1960s, what has your research uncovered?
Well, So after reading Secret Teachers of the Western World and realizing this is the kind of person Jim Morrison was, I came across a video in which he had given a college roommate of his, when he was at FSU, Florida State University, a copy of The History of Magic and the Occult, which the English version came out in 1949, which is written by the surrealist artist Kurt Seligman, who emigrated to the United States to escape Nazism like all the other artists did back then when they came to New York. And I realized after I found this book that it's more or less probably one of the first accounts, if not the first account written by an artist about the Western esoteric tradition. And Jim Morrison found it in a branch library in high school in Alexandria, Virginia, and he never returned it. He kept it. And then he gave it to his friend in 1963, so he had it for a few years. And this book is more or less, the same topic as Colin Wilson's The Occult and Gary Lachman's The Secret Teachers of the Western World. I mean, the effect that the Secret Teachers of the Western World had on me, and the effect that Colin Wilson's The Occult had on Gary Lachman when he was in Blondie and he wanted to become a writer, I think was the same effect that The History of Magic and the Occult, written by Kurt Seligman, had on Jim Morrison. It was a clue into who he was, that he did have a close connection to this other reality, that there's more than just what our five senses are telling us about the world. And he, from what I've read in this is complicated, from what I've made this as brief as I can, and no one here gets out alive, the behavior that he experiences in high school is all the behavior, of someone going through a spiritual awakening, someone awakening to that other reality. And it's a very difficult time. And Jim Morrison was doing what a lot of books advise us to do today if you go into any bookstore, to read more books on spirituality and to journal and to do all of those things. Jim Morrison loved Franz Kafka, so he journaled immensely. So he was opening himself up to the occult, to that other reality. He was going to the Library of Congress and checking out books on 14th, 15th century demonology and things like this. He had a voracious curiosity that he followed. It was insatiable. I mean, he read and he read and he read, and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote extensively about everything that he read. And one of those books was The History of Magic and the Occult. And then in 1964, Rachid Eliad's study, Shamanism, technique, I forget the whole title, but it's about shamanism. to this day, it's like one of the most fascinating texts about shamanism, and I'm pretty sure that Jim Morrison found this book when he was at UCLA. I mean, he was taking courses, with other people at that time who were very much into occult subjects, and then he decided that shamanism seemed to provide an answer with what it was that he was born, to do. Okay. And the shaman is all about the healer in the tribe because they have that strong connection with the other reality, with that other reality. And even though Jim Morrison wasn't trained like the shamans that we read about in the different cultures around the world, he was definitely opened up enough to that other reality and had the mind and the talent to respond to that other reality through his artwork, through poetry, that he did become a kind of modern shaman this way. And he did take his own initiation process, very seriously in doing that.
Well, just unpack that a little bit for us, Paul, because we've had some others on the show who have identified other popular stars of music or whatever as shamanic in a sense, that idea of the stage performance being more than just a stage performance. In your researches, has there been any sense where Morrison was kind of conscious of that? He was conscious, obviously, he was a great rock star and the interaction with the audience as an artist, be it as a poet or a musician or whatever. But do you feel that at any point in your researches you've glimpsed that Morrison saw more of a connection with an audience than purely an artistic one?
Yes, he did. To him, it was a religious experience. And I think that's what made him such a threat in the eyes of the establishment in the United States, that this was someone whose personality and stage performance is so powerful that they're basically turning on America's baby boomers, and bringing them to a place of cosmic consciousness. Then you can't just go to a door show and just have spiritual enlightenment, et cetera, and so forth. But what Jim Morrison was is that he appropriated his really powerful presence, to wake people up, to snap them out of what Colin Wilson, called the robot. Where you experience those glitches in the matrix, where you do realize that there's a whole other reality. And that's what Jim Morrison, was about. He wanted to wake his audiences up. He wanted them to leave that show feeling that they're going to be thinking about what they just experienced, for a while. It wasn't just music and pleasure and having fun. It was a whole dramatic, experience. And he learned this from Antonin Artaud, with his theater of cruelty and et cetera and so forth. That you connect with the audience by shocking them out of their complacency. And Jim Morrison had quite a gift for doing that. Sometimes they ended up in riots. I mean, this is, it's explosive, what the kinds of artistic ideas that Jim Morrison was able to put into practice, during his performances. So yes, there was it was all about having this great religious experience, in the form of a rock concert. Yes, absolutely.
And would this then link in with the shamanic idea of the sort of wounded healer, that the figure that you've painted of him in Paris is very much of somebody who's exhausted by this process? And was there an element where he saw himself as almost like some sort of sacrificial victim to this experience?
I think so. I think he was very steeped in Nietzsche, and like that statement from Nietzsche comes to mind, like a sacrifice of your highest types. And in a way, Jim Morrison, was that kind of person. And I think, out of all the things that were going through his mind, in Paris, I mean, one of them must have been like, I need to somehow be able to save my life from this. Because if I go back to the United States, not only I do not know what's going to happen with the court issue, I just don't know what kind of rock star I'm going to go on to become. Like, he just can't always be doing lots and lots of drugs and not really taking care of himself and going into these like shamanic paroxysms on stage. Our bodies are electric. And spiritual waking experiences are powerful. Like you can burn yourself out. You can do that. You can fry all the circuits if you're not careful. With your spiritual and occult experiences, right? And I think Jim Morrison was aware of that. That's one of the reasons why he drank. He told his friend Frank Losanjo that I drink just to shut the demons up in my mind that are pushing me to create. I mean, that's really, really powerful stuff. So when he was in Paris, I think you're right. I think he was struggling with this whole archetype of the wounded healer and how he was going to save his life. You know, John Densmore, the drummer in the Doors, said that anybody who was capable of just pulling a disappearing act, you know, it would have been Jim Morrison. Well, and he certainly had all the means, you know, to do so, and he certainly had the motive to do so, being, you know, afraid of what was going to happen. You know, if he went back to the United States with the court case on appeal. I think more of the truth is that on the death certificate it says he died of a heart attack, and at the time, the first responders in Paris found him in the bathtub in the apartment that he shared with Pamela Courson, and Pamela Courson is only 24 years old at this time, and you know she's a heroin addict. And I think the people on the scene like Agnes Varda and Alan Rene were friends of Jim Morrison, were Parisians and were wise to how things worked there. I think they sought to protect her. And you know, we don't really know what was going on, but on the death certificate, there's not a listing of next of kin, which sped along the process to release the body for burial. So Jim's parents and his family were in contact with the United States, and this allowed for a fast burial. And also Bill Siddons, the manager, he flew there to see what was going on. And in his conversation with Ray Manzarek, he told Ray Manzarek, I did not lift the coffin, I didn't see his body. And Ray Manzarek's reaction was that basically we might have buried an empty coffin. So I think maybe it's more in the realm of likelihood that they want to speed along the process to get Jim Morrison's body buried so they can get Pamela Courson out of France. Because if the more that process was slowed down, the more the Parisian authorities, they might have made a decision to do an autopsy. And if they did an autopsy and they found heroin, then it's possible that it becomes a murder case. And that would put Pamela Courson as like the prime suspect. So I think the people on that scene that day were looking out for Pamela Courson to protect her as much as they could. And in doing so, just, you know, speed the process along to release the body to be buried. I think that's more likely the truth.
In your researches, Paul, and also you're looking at the whole life of Jim Morrison, do you think there was a sort of sad inevitability to the events of Paris in 1971?
Yes. Jim Morrison, for as beautiful and wonderful as a person that he is, it's a hard story, and it's a tragic story. This is a very interesting anecdote. Pamela and him took a trip to Morocco, and I don't know if it was on the way to Morocco from Paris or on the way back to Paris from Morocco, but Jim Morrison loved Hieronymus Bosch, the Renaissance artist. He was Dutch. And they stopped to see the triptych, the famous triptych painted by him called The Garden of Earthly Delights in the Prado Museum in Madrid. And Jim Morrison had been studying this painting since FSU. Like, he wrote a paper about it, in which he made this wild argument that Bosch was a 2nd century like Adamite, people who like to go to church naked and worship in the nude. But if you look at the triptych goes from like, you know, persons who are like they're out in nature and, you know, they're nude and they're in a place of ecstasy and pleasure and all of that, and then it moves across as your eyes pan across the triptych to the right into a scene of like torture and pain. Okay. You know, pleasure and pain. And, you know, Jim Morrison stood in front of this painting, you know, for hours, you know, at the Prado in Madrid. And I think that he was, all kinds of thoughts going through his head. And one of those was William Blake, you know, excess leads to the palace of wisdom, where you have so much pleasure going on. And then it's going to be balanced out, and you're going to bring about a lot of, you know, pain, you know, at the same time, a lot of wisdom and everything like that, and all of that is incorporated, you know, in Bosch's triptych. And he was basically somebody who was living, you know, as the figures, you know, in Bosch's triptych, as this rock star who had like, you know, years of all kinds of like, you know, pleasure, you know, beautiful like rock star experiences with drugs and sex at parties and, you know, all kinds of stuff and relationships. And at the same time, it brought a lot of health to him. It brought a lot of torture, brought a lot of pain. And one of those ways it came to him was he was just not sure if he was going to be remembered for being the kind of person that he wanted to be, that he was, and that was a poet. He was afraid that he would just get remembered as a drunk sex symbol rock star that led this wild, irresponsible life, and nobody was going to remember him. Fortunately, his poetry was published, and his notebooks were published too with all of his other poetry, and also we remember just what a brilliant lyricist he was. Also, his interviews were fantastic. For someone so young, he had so much wisdom to offer. He once said that he felt that the interview was going to be the art form of the future. And look where we are now. Like, YouTube is nothing but people being interviewed, and that's what people mostly like to tune into these days. He had the touch of the prophet to him.
Absolutely.
A fascinating person that I could talk about for a long time, for sure.
Well, unfortunately, Paul, our time has, the clock has beaten us on this one, but you've certainly, I think, given people a lot to think about, that there are many different sides to Jim Morrison than maybe what a lot of people see printed, if I can put it like that. So tell people where they can find out more about you, your work, and also where they can pick up a copy of your book.
Sure. My book is available to all the major outlets, online here in the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia and everywhere. And then my website is paulwyld.com.
Paul, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed this.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality. From ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.